My name is Volker Kruger from Velden-Duffey Attorneys. I'm joined by Est-Marie McCallaghan. Our regular listeners will recall that we previously actually discussed this decision that we're going to deal with today as well. That was the decision of the Supreme Court of Appeal, if I'm not mistaken. And today we're going to talk about the decision of the Constitutional Court. So the matter was taken on appeal to the Constitutional Court, and then we'll hear what the outcome of that decision was. Maybe you can just refresh our memory. Est-Marie, obviously the listeners can listen to that podcast. It's still available on our website. But what happened?
Good morning, Volker. I'm very excited to discuss this judgment today because it's a massive victory for all victims of crime. I was very disappointed back then with the judgment from the Supreme Court of Appeal. What happened is that Ms. K, as she was referred to in this case, was abducted on a beach, and she was held for hours on a beach. In the dunes behind the beach, where she was assaulted and raped for, I can't recall the hours, but it was from early in the afternoon till early the next morning. And she issued summons against the police to hold them liable for her damages, specifically psychological damages that she suffered as a result of that. And the case was based there on that the police failed to properly search for her in the hours that after she was abducted, and secondly, failed to properly investigate the crime thereafter, because to this day, nobody has been arrested and barely any progress has been made in regards to this case. And like you mentioned, we've done the judgment from the Supreme Court of Appeal, but in short, the Supreme Court of Appeal found the police not liable, one, on the grounds that they felt that it would open the floodgates for everybody to sue the police if they felt that they didn't do their job properly, which is perhaps necessary to be able to do. And secondly, the Supreme Court of Appeal also felt that the police did everything within their power and resources on the evening to look for her, and therefore the police acted reasonably in the circumstances and did not act negligently. And ultimately, she lost the case in the Supreme Court of Appeal with a cost order against her. And luckily, she appealed to the Constitutional Court.
So it's a delictual claim, no? The argument being that there's a legal obligation on the police to do their job properly if something like this happened. And her argument is that they failed to do the job properly, and consequently, she argued that the police and the state therefore should be held liable for damages.
Yes, there's a legal duty on them, but also more importantly, there's a constitutional duty on the police to keep us safe, to prevent crime, and to ultimately do their job properly when there is crime.
And that was why the case ended up in the Constitutional Court, because of that constitutional obligation, and because that's the highest court in the country that has the final say. So this outcome now is obviously a precedent that will govern all future decisions by courts in the country dealing with similar facts.
Yes. As you mentioned, this is the highest court. So this is the final say in the matter. And going forward, this case can be used as precedent for all other cases to follow.
Okay, and what did the Constitutional Court find? You already mentioned that she was successful with an appeal.
Yes. So the Constitutional Court found that the police did fail to conduct a proper search for her in the hours that she was being held captive in the bushes behind the beach, and that they did not act reasonably as could be expected of them in those circumstances. And secondly, they also failed to properly conduct an investigation thereafter to try and hold her perpetrator accountable. So as I've mentioned, the facts of the matter was very detailed, and the Supreme Court of Appeal as well as the Constitutional Court looked into detail in everything that the police did, every type of search they did, every type of investigation they did. I'm not going to go into that much detail. But in short, you might recall when we did the Supreme Court of Appeal judgment, I mentioned that there was a helicopter search for her. There was a car that drove along the shoreline to search for her because I thought she might have drowned. And then there was also one police officer with a dog that walked on the beach and search for her. The negligent component in regards to this search came in with the following. The Constitutional Court said that the very basic thing that the police could have done and should have done in these circumstances was also to conduct a foot search of her on the beach and in the dunes, call out her name, because the evidence before the court was that the police officers were just sort of standing around in the parking lot while the one guy was walking on the beach with the dog. So the very basic thing they should have done is to do a foot search for her and call out her name. And the second thing is you might recall that the dog and the officer that walked with the dog turned around a short distance before the fence on the beach. And they didn't search that last portion, and that is where she was held captive. So the Constitutional Court found is if they just walked that little distance further up until the fence, they might have found her. So in regards to that, they were found to be negligent. They didn't act reasonably in searching for her. In regards to the investigation afterwards, where they were also found negligent, the court said they didn't timeously look at the CCTV footage. The Supreme Court of Appeal said, well, it was the obligation of the victim to look at the footage and identify her perpetrator. And the Constitutional Court said, no, you cannot place that duty of the police on a victim, even though she might be able to identify him. But the police never timeously looked at that CCTV footage to identify a few people that were on the beach and look for those people. And then the second thing that the police lacked in the investigation afterwards, there were a lot of bush dwellers that lived in the dunes on that beach. And the police didn't interview a single one of them. And the court found that the starting point for the police in looking for a perpetrator would have been to interview these people that live on the beach to find out, did they see anything, did they hear anything. It might actually have been one of them that was the perpetrator. The police didn't interview a single one of them. So because of this, in short, is when the Constitutional Court found that the police should be held liable because they didn't act reasonably and they failed in their constitutional duty towards the plaintiff.
I guess one can say that the police doesn't have to be perfect. No? What the police needs to do is to act reasonably in the circumstances and do what the reasonable policeman with the training and experience that a reasonable policeman should have would have done in the circumstances. And what you just explained, I guess, are basic things that they should have done and that could have prevented the harm.
Yes, exactly. You summed it up quite correctly. The police doesn't have to be perfect. Nobody is perfect. The test is not whether they are perfect. The test is whether they acted reasonably within the resources available to them at the time. And just walking around, for example, and doing a foot search cost absolutely no resources. The officers were there. They just didn't walk around and search for her. So the test is always, did the police act reasonably? I want to mention the Supreme Court of Appeal said that they can't allow this type of case because it would absolutely open the floodgates for everybody to sue the police. But the Constitutional Court said no, it wouldn't, because you have to evaluate the facts of each case separately. The police would not necessarily be negligent in every type of case where a perpetrator is not found or where a victim is not found. You have to evaluate the evidence of that circumstance. And ultimately, if the police know that they can be held accountable like this, they might take that into account when they are doing their investigations.
So with there obviously being a lot of victims of crime in the country, one needs to point that out, that the liability of the police is not limitless, not faultless.
Yes.
You have to look at the facts of each case to determine whether there was indeed negligence on the case of the police, whether they failed to do what the reasonable policeman would have done in the circumstances. So if there are any listeners that might now contemplate a claim against the police, then I think one should advise them to go and see your attorney and explain the facts. And then based on that, your attorney should be able to advise you as to whether you have a chance of succeeding with the case or not.
Yes, I always mention this when we do any matter, any delictual matter, is do your homework properly at the beginning of the matter. Before you institute summons and you might be left with a hefty legal bill, you and your attorney should investigate and evaluate and analyze the facts properly and make sure you have a good case, because you don't necessarily have a case by default against the police, like I mentioned, if a perpetrator is not found for the crime committed against you.
And keep in mind that there are certain prescription periods that apply to claims of this nature. So make sure that if you are a victim of a crime, that you go and see your attorney as soon as possible, because otherwise that claim might prescribe. In other words, it might lapse if you wait too long. So I think that's also important to point out.
Yes.
All right. As you said, I guess that's good news for victims of crime. Certainly sad set of facts for this lady that instituted the claim, but at least there's some good news now from the Constitutional Court.
Yes, for sure.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.